This podcast contains discussions on sexual misconduct. Topics such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment may be discussed. Listener discretion is advised, and we encourage self-care and seeking professional support as needed.
Regardless of your role, regardless of your gender, sexual identity, the right to your own body is inviolate. This is what we refer to when we talk about bodily autonomy.
Dr. Pascale Allotey is the Director of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research at the World Health Organization. In this episode, she addresses critical issues surrounding sexual exploitation and abuse, grounded in the principles of human rights and gender equity.
The absolute fundamental issue here is grounded in human rights. So Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights guarantees the right to life, liberty, and security of person.
We delve into the staggering global statistics related to sexual violence.
The last global estimates that were released, 1 in 4 women 15 years and older had experienced or had been subjected to intimate partner violence.
And Dr. Allotey highlights the critical role of power in instances of sexual violence.
Sexual violence, sexual abuse, harassment, exploitation is always the imposition of somebody in a greater position of power, imposing themselves on somebody who is less powerful than they are. It is always a question of power.
This is the #NoExcuse podcast. We discuss the challenges, complexities, and potential solution in preventing and responding to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the humanitarian and development sectors. You'll hear interviews with victims and survivors, experts, aid workers, artists, and leaders. The podcast is produced by the World Health Organization's Department for the Prevention and Response to Sexual Misconduct. I am Guni Dias, your host and Global PRS Network Coordinator for the department. Welcome, Pascale.
Thank you very much.
Pascale, you've been leading in gender equity, health, and human rights. Give us a background on your take with regards to sexual exploitation and abuse.
Okay, so the absolute fundamental issue here, I'll ground it in human rights. So Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights guarantees the right to life, liberty, and security of person. This means that regardless of your role, regardless of your gender, sexual identity, the right to your own body is inviolate. This is what we refer to when we talk about bodily autonomy. So the choice of who you share that body with, whether it is through sexual intimacy, whether it's even through having a baby, has to be a matter of choice. And that is absolutely inviolate. We know that in terms of sexual violence, sexual abuse, it is absolutely grounded in power. Because for anyone to feel that they have an entitlement to somebody else's body is absolutely is arguably an absolute violation of human rights. So that is the starting point for our work in the Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health, for the work that we do on violence against women and gender-based violence in general. So sexual violence, sexual abuse, harassment, exploitation is always the imposition of somebody in a greater position of power, imposing themselves on somebody who is less powerful than they are. So that provides us with the grounding for how it is we try to define the different degrees, whether it's abuse, whether it's harassment. It is always a question of power.
Pascale, at WHO and now in many other organizations, as you know, we use the word sexual misconduct to encompass sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. And WHO is working on institutional and organizational change to prevent sexual misconduct through the department. And understanding these behaviors, these enabling behaviors, is key. You mentioned before abuse of power. Given your background in gender-based violence, where the focus is on societal gender issues, could you provide figures and data that could help us better understand sexual misconduct?
I think the work on gender-based violence and sexual violence in WHO started quite a while ago. I don't know, in the mid 1990s with Claudia Garcia Moreno and team. And over the years has advanced to trying to understand the antecedents of this behavior that is unacceptable. And I think WHO is a global leader now in the estimates, in determining the global estimates of sexual violence. And it's gone from trying to look at the data and trying to understand the differences between data that are collected through, whether it's through the police, through women's shelters, through hospitals, and so on. And those are just the tip of the iceberg, because it does require that the victims move to the point where they actually report it. And we know that it is well beyond that. I think the characterization of sexual misconduct in particular tries to be a little bit all-encompassing and is important for the purposes very specifically of trying to understand and address the institutional related behaviors. But I think we have to be very clear it is absolutely much more than that. And so the various estimates that we started initially with a series of country studies, try to understand some of the risk factors and so on. And that has then moved on to what now are the global estimates that are produced in collaboration with some of the other UN agencies and academic communities and so on. So we know that from the last studies, the last global estimates that were released, 1 in 4 women 15 years and older had experienced or had been subjected to intimate partner violence. It is harder to estimate the work-related, what tends to be much more in the broader work-related sexual misconduct. And a survey published by ILO, the International Labour Organization, shows that globally 6.3% of respondents experience sexual violence or harassment at work, such as, and this includes things like unwanted touching, comments, emails, sexual requests, and so on. And the figure, broken down, the figure was about 8% for women and 5% for men within the workplace. Okay. It is a continuum of behaviors, but if the what may be considered the milder versions aren't stopped, it institutionalizes a culture that says it's okay, that usually men are entitled to treat women or talk to them, or that you're just creating the kind of culture that is just not acceptable, and it needs to be stopped sooner rather than later.
And what have you observed so far with regards to the challenges that victims or survivors encounters when they seek help, when they seek support?
So because it is, I mean, essentially when I talk about that it is all grounded in power, we do live in a patriarchal system. The tendency is for the victims to be blamed, that it is in some ways they called it upon themselves because it's never the man's fault. And that is also, that's very clear globally as well when you look at some of the global discussions around whether it's the kind of the hashtag Me Too movement and so on, that it is always somehow the woman's fault that the behavior that was perpetrated against her happened. And it is such a grounded part of our culture that it is not solely about the victim, the external reaction to it, but it is also very much internalized for women. So there is the sense that I did something wrong, or it can be so powerfully disempowering that anything we try to do, all our interventions have to keep that as an absolute forefront of how it is we address and work with people, with victims of sexual misconduct, sexual violence, and so on, that they have undergone a life-transforming experience. If it is in the workplace, if it is in It is absolutely a part of your life. This is a cumulative experience across your life course that is going to change your life. So if in trying to address it, we don't take that absolute disempowered experience and we don't try to ensure that our intervention supports an empowering of the person as well, then we're almost as culpable, and we don't encourage, we don't create the atmosphere that will allow for healing and for moving forward for the survivor of the experience as well. So I think that is one of the critical things, that there is a tendency for the community to blame the victim in some way. There is an internalization of that
victim
blame.
blaming.
So there is a lot of that institutional change that needs to take place as well. For WHO in particular, I think if we are going to take this seriously, we do have to make sure that our first line or all the support that we provide does actually take into account that it has to be, as much as the institution and the person needs to be held accountable, the approach has to be empowering for the victim to come forward, so that we don't end up re-traumatizing through the system that is supposed to be trying to correct, and to move it to the much more clinical level, and reflecting the work that we've done as well in HRP. It's very much obviously within the context of WHO, and where we sit within universal health coverage, we have to work very closely with the health systems. So we've had released a series of products that are about training healthcare providers, are about making sure that screening is possible to help to identify the victims, to make sure that we have there's the full access to, whether it's HIV prophylaxis, whether it's emergency contraception, all of those services. But it has to be, our health systems have to be aware that this is something that they need to screen for. And so there's a whole lot of training as well that needs to be, an investment that needs to be done in the system to ensure that it is empowering ultimately for the victim to be able to access the services that she needs.
We've touched upon some of the challenges for the victims and survivors coming forward. Regarding support services, are men and women and trans able to access those services with the same ease?
I think this is why I started with a human rights framing of the issue. It should not matter who you are. And it is very clear that in terms of sexual violence, I mean, in our whole area of sexual health in particular is interesting and tricky, because it is where, when you talk about sexual health, you are talking about not just the individual, but the individual with other. You don't get an STI on your own. So it shouldn't make a huge difference conceptually that the idea of sexual misconduct, of sexual violation, is about another exerting power, is an issue of one exerting power over another. So at that fundamental level, it shouldn't make a difference. The difference is perhaps maybe in places where, or in settings where, there is an extra layer of discrimination associated with sexual identity. And so those may be issues, again, that may be brought to the fore. But I still, in terms of the response, it really is fundamentally an issue of power, and that is what we need to break down. It shouldn't make a difference in terms of the support that is given. It is fundamentally a human rights issue, and we need to use all of the services and all of the evidence that we have to address it.
What's a change you would like to see in order to have victims or survivors feel more comfortable in speaking up?
There are 5 major changes. As I say, and I'll keep emphasizing it, the need for social norm change, which is not blaming and stigmatizing the survivors, that it is not the responsibility. The responsibility does not lie solely with the victim, and the system needs to be accountable. Secondly, as I say, as WHO, we need to train our first responders for the first line support, how disclosures are made and all of that. There has to be very, very clear support that ensures that the survivors are able to trust that they are in a safe place.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that there is no impunity and there is accountability. So we have to see much more what is happening. And I know there is always genuinely a challenge of the balance between the innocent until proven guilty. So due process, all of that does need to happen. But it is really important as well that the process is a fair process and that there is absolutely accountability. So investigations need to be timely for everybody's, for whether it's somebody who's been accused or whether it's the survivor. The processes need to be timely so that they're seen to work. We need to invest in expanding the coverage for quality services for all survivors, including those subjected to sexual misconduct specifically by WHO staff and contractors and so on. And perhaps the most important is the actions needed as an institution to prevent sexual misconduct from happening in the first place. So we need to call out our male colleagues. We need leadership from male colleagues calling out other male colleagues as well. If we can prevent it, it's absolutely critical for that to happen.
You've mentioned speaking up, having men colleague, call out and support their male colleague in their own behaviors that are perpetrating these type of behaviors. Why is it important to speak up? For the survivor, it might come across as a difficult task to do because with all these challenges that presents themselves, why speak up?
We're not going to see any change if we don't. It is a problem and we have to find the solution for it. It is the cost of not speaking up is great. It has deeply, as I say, this is, it is life transformative. It has deep experience. It has deep impact on those who, both victims, whether they're victims or survivors. I cannot emphasize enough that there is, whether it is physical, whether it's psychological, it impacts on productivity, it impacts on absenteeism. If you don't have a safe workplace, I mean, we spend so much more of our lives in work than we do anywhere else. So if we cannot be guaranteed that it is a safe place to come to, that is a pretty awful quality of life. That has life-changing impacts on your experiences and on your ability to engage in relationships with anyone else. And I think for organizations, for humanitarian organizations, for you, an organization like WHO, which is part of the United Nations, which is supposed to be about our values, it is absolutely unacceptable that we would not hold dear these values and break the trust that any individual, and it doesn't matter who the person is, that we would break that trust and subject a person to sexual misconduct is just not acceptable. So yes, we are obliged to do everything that we can to try and address this.
Thank you, Pascal. Last question to close off. What is something that makes you hopeful in this area?
What is something that makes me hopeful in this area? That we are addressing it. It's taken a long time. It is, if I, again, just focusing on our department, it has taken a good 30 years to get to the point where even much more broadly, gender-based violence, violence against women is sufficiently a political priority issue, that it is in the SDGs, that we are being held accountable to ensure that we address it. So yes, I think it's been slow going, and I suspect it will still continue to be an uphill battle. But at least it has got the priority that it has been elevated to a level of priority. That means that eyes are on us and we do have to do something about it.
Thank you, Pascal.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the World Health Organization's #NoExcuse podcast. We hope we've given you another perspective on preventing and responding to sexual misconduct in the humanitarian and development sectors. We release new episodes every 2 weeks. But if you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions in the meantime, feel free to reach out at prseah@who.int. Until the next time, goodbye.